One of the most interesting characters in all of A Song of Ice and Fire lore has to be Brandon the Builder, the founder of House Stark from the Age of Heroes, who's credited with building Winterfell, the Wall, and apparently Storm's End and the High Tower, and many other things if you believe all the stories. With all the incredible stories and achievements attributed to this character, I feel like it is worth taking the time to ask the question, was Brandon the Builder actually even real? This is something that's been on my mind a lot lately because I have a really long video that I'm working on that hopefully will be coming out not too long after this one, where a lot of the legends around Brandon the Builder and the ancient Starks feature pretty heavily in what I'm going to be talking about. And also, I was just recently on a live stream on the channel Something to Talk About where we were talking about all the old Kings of Winter, so this topic of Brandon the Builder came up pretty quickly. If you want to check out that live stream, I'll have it as one of the end cards at the end of this video, but first I'd like to just have the full discussion about Brandon the Builder and try get to the bottom of whether or not he was real. I feel like a good place to start is with a direct George R. R. Martin quote that is on the Brandon the Builder wiki page. No one can even say for certain if Brandon the Builder ever lived. He is as remote from the time of the novels as Noah and Gilgamesh are from our own time. So there you have George's thoughts on the matter in pretty simple words. We don't really know if Brandon the Builder actually was even a real person. But I don't think that's actually where this discussion ends. While it may be true that in the real world we could never really know the details of some first king of a kingdom that was founded 6,000 years ago, at the same time there was a real first king of that kingdom. Somebody founded it, and in the same way someone founded House Stark. Someone built the wall, someone built Winterfell, someone seems to have worked with the Children of the Forest to sign the pact, and if our characters could ever get down into the crypts of Winterfell and they could get past that wall that's collapsed that's blocked off the lower parts of it, they would find that someone was the first Stark to be buried in those crypts. So whether it was really Brandon the Builder or whether it was just some random guy, there was a real person who did all this stuff. There is a first Stark who is buried in the crypts of Winterfell who probably built the place. And so, on some level, Brandon the Builder is real. So, with that in mind, I think the questions we need to ask are how close was the real Brandon the Builder to the legends? What can we actually know about what really went on? And is that going to teach us anything about the story today or what could possibly happen in the future books? Let's start with the question of what can we expect the founder of House Stark to actually look like? Someone from back in the Age of Heroes. Well, luckily, George R. R. Martin has been specifically asked about this as well, and he gave a fairly detailed answer.
I mean, fantasy frequently has these long-lived dynasties or histories, and it's just presented to you as fact. This is what happened 23,000 years ago, and here it is. And the truth is, we don't know what happened 23,000 years ago. We hardly know what happened, 200 years ago. I mean, we even here in America, we have our legends: George Washington and the cherry tree, Paul Bunyan and Babe, the big blue ox, Pecos Bill, all of these stories. And our country is like 200 years old, and yet, what's the fact behind them? Well, sometimes there is no fact behind them. It's just history getting embroidered, or sometimes there is a nugget of fact. And I wanted to get that sense here. Now, the Age of Heroes has larger-than-life characters in it like Brandon the Builder and Lan the Clever and Durin Guardsgrief, and there are these great stories about them, but who knows whether any of this ever happened or what the true story is. The Maesters don't. They're trying to construct it just like you are, and I've had some fun about writing from that viewpoint in the book. Like the Maester observed, Brandon the Builder evidently, he must have lived for like 400 years, and he traveled around Westeros, and he built everything of significance. And clearly that's ludicrous, but it formulates the George Washington slept here phenomenon that you see, where any artifact gets attached to Charlemagne or King Arthur. I mean, travel around England and King Arthur was fucking everywhere. There are like 7 round tables and numerous castles and things like that. So I'm trying to indicate the same thing. But am I ever going to write the real, true history? Well, no, I'm not. They were probably just a bunch of like Westerosi cavemen.
The first thing that I want to bring up that he says is that the idea of Brandon the Builder having actually built every single thing of significance in Westeros is pretty ridiculous. And he compares it to the idea of every little inn that claims George Washington slept here, Or in England, how everywhere says that, yeah, King Arthur stayed here, and there are 7 different round tables and all that stuff. George is deliberately building a world where the Maesters are just trying their best to cobble history together from legends and oral traditions and things like that, and the little bit that has been written down over the ages. And they know that they don't have the accurate picture, but they're doing their best. Then he ended the answer by saying that he's never going to go and write like the true history of the Age of Heroes and tell everyone what actually happened, but then joked that there were probably just like Westerosi cavemen or something. Which basically just means, I think, yeah, they were primitive Westerosi, no more special or magical or heroic than any of the characters we have alive today, just way back earlier in time. So that's roughly what I would expect Brandon the Builder to look like. They would be roughly like the Starks that we see today, it's just that the world would be entirely different around them. Rather than Westeros being filled with tons of castles that have stood for 10,000 years and are full of tradition, everything was much more of a blank slate right after the Long Night. And as we go here, we will get into why I place Brandon the Builder or the Founder Stark at the time of the Long Night. I just think that's something that makes a lot of sense. But to the point that these characters in the Age of Heroes are basically just the same as our characters today, that is an easy way to get your mind thinking that, okay, they're probably not actually doing anything all that remarkable or all that magical, because they're just normal people. But let's remember, these are still normal people in a fantasy world. Our characters today are likely going to do some pretty incredible magical things, especially Bran himself. People who seem to be the descendants of the original Bran the Builder seem to have access to this magical power in today's Westeros as well, especially as magic seems to be returning more powerfully into the world. All of the Starks suddenly have all this incredible magical power. And let's remember that at the time of Brandon the Builder and the Long Night and the Pact and all this stuff, it seems like magic was much more powerful in the world, or at least more active. I think that most fans who read the books come to the conclusion that there is some connection between the Old Gods' magic and the Stark dynasty. It would be just incredibly weird for the Starks to be the ones who have been in charge for so long if it wasn't magically connected. But if you believe that the Old Gods favor the Starks, well then suddenly it actually starts to make sense that they would have maintained the power for so long. So, with enough evidence, I think of some magical connection between the Starks and either the Children of the Forest, the Others, the Old Gods, the Weirwoods, something, choose your flavor that you prefer. The Starks seem to have magical power backing their dynasty. So, with keeping in mind the fact that we are seeing a current modern day Stark go meet up with the Children of the Forest and unlock incredible magical abilities, actually thinking that Brandon the Builder, if he was working with the Children of the Forest to found House Stark, would have incredible magical abilities makes a lot of sense. And I think we should take very seriously the idea that the founder Stark worked with the Children of the Forest. That feels like a part of the legend that is just implied to be true with all the evidence that we see. So, Brandon the Builder, if you want to call him that, or call him the Founder Stark, or whatever you want to call him, we don't necessarily care if his name was actually Brandon or not. But Brandon the Builder working with the Children of the Forest feels confirmed to me. Just looking at the dynasty that he founded, when you have this result, I would expect that part of the suspect profile we're looking for is a magically powerful person who was probably working with the Children of the Forest and built Winterfell. I think the question we have to ask then is what else is Brandon the Builder actually responsible for? I think a good place to start is did the founder Stark also build the wall? For this question, I would say I think yes, and the reason for that is it feels to me like the construction methods are at the very least pretty similar. I won't go too deep into detail, but I think that if you can put weirwoods inside the walls of your structure, you can get a magical ward from this. I'll talk about it a little bit more later in the video, but we're shown this a little bit by Bloodraven's cave where the entrance is in between 2 weirwoods. I think we have pretty good reason to suspect that there's weirwoods both inside the walls of Winterfell and inside the wall itself. Whether that means it's actually the same person or not, I guess you don't really know. It's definitely possible that they could have been done by different people and just all the credit was given to the same guy, and they were probably constructed pretty close in the same time period. But I do think it does make sense that it was just straight up the same guy, and here's why. Let's just go back to our idea that these Age of Heroes figures were no different from the modern Starks that we see today. And the Brandon Stark that we see today is the one who's working with the Children of the Forest, is connected to the Weirwood magic and the Old Gods, in the way that it really does feel like Bran the Builder is also built up to be. Well, what do we see getting promised to Bran? Extended life thanks to the Weirwoods. And we see Bloodraven, who's already tied himself up to the Weirwoods, who has lingered long past what his lifespan should have been, and is still out there able to, direct people and do things. And so, yeah, Brandon the Builder, I think, is likely tied up into the Weirwood net in a similar way. I think he was probably one of the first, if not the first, human greenseer, the founder of House Stark, the one who originally teamed up with the Children of the Forest, the one who is said to be the only person who was able to speak the language of the Children of the Forest. He just has all of these really strong Children of the Forest connections. It would almost be weird if they didn't strap him up to a weirwood tree and extend his life. That's just like the Stark role, right? They are the old godsy kings that are connected to the old ways and the Children of the Forest and the Weirwoods. That's just to me what feels set up. Bran the Builder was a Stark greenseer king with the help of the Children of the Forest and an extended life to lay the foundations of an age right after the previous long night. The current day Bran is going to be a Stark greenseer king with an extended life and the help of the Children of the Forest, who's laying the foundations for a new age after the long night. That's why he ended up as the king in the show. George is building that up in the books. He's going to be the Bran the Builder for a new age. So yeah, there was a Bran the Builder. He probably did look a heck of a lot just like a normal person, just like our Bran is. But that doesn't mean he's not going to be able to accomplish a lot of incredible things because our Bran is also going to be able to do that. So yeah, I think it does make a lot of sense that he would have built the wall and would have built Winterfell. All of this foundation laying is probably taking place during his reign, which probably would be extended by Weirwood and Children of the Forest magic. That reading of Bran the Builder to me as a green seer king with an extended lifespan, therefore making him pretty capable of achieving a lot of the things that he was said to have done, feels like it's not even that conspiratorial or tinfoil or whatever you want to say. That just feels like the straightforward reading of Bran the Builder. Why wouldn't he have been linked up to the Weirwoods in the same way the current day Bran is? It just doesn't really make sense that he wouldn't be. When you recognize what people in this world are capable of when they're tied in with Weirwood magic or the Children of the Forest, it wouldn't even require Bran the Builder to be anything more than a Westerosi caveman, as George joked, for him to actually be doing a lot of these things. I have no doubt that there's a lot of places that are trying to co-opt his legend and claiming, oh yeah, he built this too, and he also built this and that and this and that. And I think that is what George is getting at when he says it's ridiculous how many things are claimed to be built by Bran the Builder. But he has also set up a situation that pretty heavily implies a very powerful founder of House Stark did do a lot of these things, and I kind of feel like that's something that will be revealed at some point when Bran starts looking back at the timeline. The depictions of Bran the Builder as more of an architect who's out there, like, actually physically designing the wall and things like that might not be true. I think he may be more realistically depicted as like a caveman shaman who was planting magical weirwoods which structures could be built around, literally just using the magic of the Children of the Forest, as he's said to do in the legends, in the way that I think we see it used, building basically ancient tree towns in the style of the Children of the Forest that are magically warded. They probably did build the stones around these ancient trees and things like that, and maybe by now those trees are even buried underground because the ages sort of do that over time. By this point, the original foundations of Winterfell may be long buried, but they could be a ring of weirwoods that are just built with some old ancient stones around them, and then they're buried now by dirt, and the modern day walls are built right on top of those. Or if not an ancient ring of trees, perhaps it's some sort of ring of roots, right? Like the roots are worked in such a way from that central Godswood heart tree that it creates a ward around the center of the tree town. There is definitely more to be learned about the tree towns, as Bran will likely continue to explore in Winds of Winter, but I really do think if you want to try and imagine what Winterfell may have looked like before the original construction was there, take a look at Bloodraven's Cave. It's a big hill with a bunch of magical trees on it, and the ward seems to be powered by the magical weirwoods. This weirwood magic in the modern day is able to keep the whites and the others outside the cave, so it makes sense that if Winterfell is able to do the same thing magically, they could have just built it on a hill that was already warded in this way. We haven't seen Winterfell explicitly blocking magic in this way just yet, but we do see it at Storm's End, which Melisandre says has old forgotten spells woven into its walls, and let's remember that Storm's End is supposedly built by Bran the Builder. or at least he advised in the construction. I kinda think that maybe what he advised the Storm King to do is to move the location onto one of these already existing tree towns that would have a ward against whatever magic kept destroying all his old castles, thus giving Bran the Builder in the legends credit for building Storm's End, when really he probably just helped by moving it to the correct magical location. That's a tangent that could be its whole own video, but the main point is it really does seem like the ward magic around all these old ancient structures is Weirwood powered tree magic, either by a ring of weirwoods or the roots or something like that. Winterfell is compared to a great stone tree, and it's said that its roots run deep, and as long as those survive, Winterfell survives. And we do think that there is some sort of magical ward around the walls, so something's gotta be going on there. And there are times where even hallways are described as going up and down, like basically they're following a big giant root. I think that it's reasonable to think there are weirwoods worked into the construction of Winterfell on pretty much every level. We may not have quite enough to prove it just yet, but I feel like by the end of the books that may change. In any case, if he is doing this weirwood sort of construction in the style of the Children of the Forest, you could really say that Bran the Builder is less of an architect and more of a gardener. I do also just feel like I should drive home the point that it makes a lot of sense that the founder of House Stark would have been around during or at the end of the Long Night. This feels like when you would lay the foundations for the New Age. This is when Brandon the Builder probably came about, and so it would make sense straight up that he would have built the wall right after the Long Night. Like if you're building Winterfell, magically warded to protect against others, and you're building the wall at the same time, that makes sense to me. And it also makes sense he would have the help of the Children of the Forest in doing this, because they were probably under the pact, which ended the war between them, and then they start arming the Watch with obsidian to chase the others north, and then they build the wall, have everything happy because they kept the others away, Starks are kept in charge, wall is maintained, all of the old ways are just established at this time. That feels like Brandon the Builder's time, if there was one king of the Starks who signed the pact with the Children of the Forest, helped them drive the others north, establish the Wall, the Watch, and Winterfell, I feel like that is something that actually could be done in one lifetime with the magical assistance of the children. Especially if you take my construction of the wall theory into mind, which you don't have to for this discussion, but it makes it a lot easier to suspect that, yeah, you could actually just have one guy mostly responsible for building the wall, if what he was doing is going with the Children of the Forest and planting a big line of weirwoods that sort of self build the wall. Before I stray too far into my theories, I do just want to address, like, hopefully what the title of the video says, was Brandon the Builder actually real, has been addressed, and you would agree that even if the legends aren't necessarily true, there was a real person who was the founder of House Stark, who is probably the first Stark in the crypts, and who probably built Winterfell. Whether his name was actually Brandon or not, or whether he did any of the specific other things in the legends, are probably up for debate, but it feels worth discussing Brandon the Builder as a real person as the founder of House Stark, because even if the details about him are mixed up, there is a real Brandon the Builder on some level. So yeah, it's up for debate on a lot of the other details around what he actually did, but I'd like to give now my opinion on how I actually currently see the Brand the Builder legend. I think that it makes a lot of sense that Brandon the Builder would have built Winterfell, and he would have built the wall. I think that Winterfell is likely built on an old Child of the Forest tree town because it's built on a big hill. Bloodraven's Cave seems to be a tree town. I have a video about that, and I'll probably have a video about Winterfell specifically at some point. I also think that it makes a lot of sense that Brandon the Builder would have been the one who was meeting with the Green Men on the Isle of Faces and signing the pact. Because, well, the Children of the Forest and the Weirwood magic seems to have put his dynasty in charge after the pact, so it just really makes sense, at least on some level, that, yeah, the guy who signed the pact is the one whose children ended up in charge. Historical events are often like dominoes where they can sit still for a very, very long time, but then as soon as one thing happens, like seven other things all fall right after one another. In that way, it's not unrealistic for one character to do many, many things and then many, many characters to not really do much in the history books. Like, that tracks actually probably pretty well. So, again, that's sort of more points towards the idea of Brandon the Builder actually doing a lot of these things and many of these significant events happening one right after the other, as a sort of changing of the age moment was actually going on. There's a quote by Lenin where he says that there are decades where nothing happens and then there are weeks where decades happen. And I think on the grand scale of history, that also sort of applies to lifetimes, especially in a world like Westeros where there seems to be magical shenanigans that are sort of causing upheaval in the world at certain times and also maintaining the order at other times. I feel like that would just amplify that effect even more. When you look at the way that these events should fall like dominoes, the end of the war with the children, the signing of the pact, the founding of the ruling dynasty after the pact, all of that does just sort of track as happening under the lifetime of one founder king. Then you extend his life a bit with Weirwood magic, which, let's keep in mind, Winterfell was built around an already existing Weirwood, so if he was linked up to that Weirwood, that would be exactly where he would want to build his castle. So you extend his life with the greenseer magic, and suddenly him helping build the wall after the others are driven north, if that's what happened, well, that would make sense. And potentially him advising on how to build Storm's End or the High Tower could also make sense. I think the High Tower is one that I feel is less likely built by Bran the Builder, but I feel like Storm's End maybe he could have advised in how to build it. That actually kinda does track to me. Considering that we don't really have any reason to suspect they happened at different times, I think it actually really makes a lot of sense that the founding of House Stark comes right after the Pact because, that's when new people would be put in charge, when the war with the Children of the Forest ends. This is when the people first started worshipping the Weirwoods, so this is when you would expect the emergence of the Weirwood based dynasty that's in charge of that entire system. And I actually do sort of think it makes a lot of sense to read the legends as saying that Bran the Builder is actually also the last hero. I've been dancing a little bit around the role of the others in this whole Stark connection and what went on in the time of Bran the Builder, and that's because I have a really long video that I've been working on that's all about the others, and we're going to talk plenty about Bran the Builder and what I think went on with the others in this time, but I do have to bring it up briefly at least just for the context of this conversation. So if you feel like you want more of this, don't worry, there's another video coming all about the others. Make sure you like and subscribe and check out the Patreon down in the description if you're so inclined. But okay, back to what we were just talking about. Let's remember the scenario that was just set up. It seems likely that the founding of the Stark dynasty would come right after the Pact, which would come right after the war with the Children of the Forest, but let's remember that we have some pretty strong hints at this point that the others, at least originally, were created by the Children of the Forest and used in that war. It's what we were shown in the television show. They further explained it in the behind the scenes HBO histories and lore that, yeah, they created the others as a weapon against the men because their numbers were so overwhelming that they needed to turn their numbers against them. They used their Weirwood magic to do this. I'll get fully into detail about how it was done because I do think I figured it out. As I said, that's coming in a longer video about the others because I want to make sure I get all the book quotes and evidence lined up so that people actually believe me. It's far too long of a discussion to be a little tangent in this video, so as I said, I'm sorry about that. But we do have evidence of this from not only the show, but the books as well. Asha Greyjoy references a story she heard about how the children turned the trees into warriors to fight the first men, and we also have the line after Sam kills another, where they joke, "Are you sure you killed another and not some child Snow Knight?" Which, if the children of the forest created the others, them being some child Snow Knight is a funny little joke from George, because that's pretty much exactly what they would be. So, for the sake of this discussion, just rolling with the idea that the children of the forest were creating others in their war with the first men. Well, then that likely means the Long Night was the culmination of that war. And they realized, okay, we don't want these others to wipe out everything. They signed the pact. They then probably had the period where the children of the forest were arming the watch with obsidian, helping the first men push the others back, and then they probably built the wall and Winterfell, founded the whole system that was post Pact and lasted until the Andals came. This is when the Starks were originally in charge. So, the last hero, being the one who is on the Isle of Faces signing the pact, makes a lot of sense because the last hero sought out the help of the Children of the Forest and with their aid ended the Long Night. That's pretty much all we know, so when you read that person as being Bran the Builder, that just really tracks because of all these little dominoes that we were just talking about. The one who went and got the help of the children was probably the one who was there signing the pact, helping drive the others north, becoming the founder of the dynasty that's in charge because of all of the things that he just did. It just tracks that it's all Bran the Builder to me. Once you recognize that in this world, normal people are capable of all those great magical things, and all of that is achievable in one lifetime of someone who's basically just like an ancient version of the Starks we see today, Well, then it makes sense that their legend would be so great that a bunch of other places would want to claim that they were built by him and that, oh yeah, he built this too and that and that. And that's the effect that George has put into the world, but that's only there because Brandon the Builder did some great things. People only claim that George Washington slept at their hotel or their inn because George Washington did found the country. He did do some cool stuff. I think this is the way we need to look at Brandon the Builder as well, and I think when we have this little historical chain of dominoes of events that probably took place in pretty quick succession, and then you factor in his greenseer, weirwood, children of the forest connections, whatever you want to call them, he maybe could have lived a little longer than normal. Well, yeah, it really does track that Brandon the Builder probably did a lot of really cool things. Definitely not everything he's claimed to have done in the legends, but enough that people want to claim descent from him and want to claim that he built their house. But let me know what you think of all of that. What do you think Brandon the Builder actually did? I'm interested to hear down in the comments. I actually think that the less interesting question is whether or not Bran the Builder is real, and the more interesting question is whether or not Bran the Builder is still alive. This feels like one of the questions about Bran the Builder that's most ignored in the fandom. When you start to recognize all of his similarities to Bran and that he was connected with the Children of the Forest, you would question why he wouldn't be tied in with the Weirwoods in the same way. And what Bran is being promised seems to be eternal life. When he goes down exploring in Hodor's body, he finds ancient greenseers deeper down in the roots, and their bodies seem to still be alive. Even though Bloodraven is called the last greenseer, it's clear that there are ancient greenseers from long ago that are still alive deeper down in the roots. They just seem to not really have that much control over their body anymore. But mentally, they could still be out there warging in ravens or doing whatever it is that they're doing, and I don't see why Brandon the Builder would be any different. Bloodraven seems like eventually he will turn into a husk that is still alive and able to do this. Bran, if he fully weds himself to the trees, will probably be the same. So if Brandon the Builder is deep down in the Weirwood roots, down in the crypts in the collapsed area that you can't get to anymore, well, then it would make sense that he's potentially just as alive as those bodies that Bran finds when he's looking through Hodor. If an alive Bran the Builder is indeed what the Stark children may find if they get through to the collapsed parts of the crypts, well, that would set up some pretty interesting potential climaxes depending on what exactly Bran the Builder has been up to for the last few thousand years. In the television show, Daenerys at least seemed to have to face the consequences of the fiery dragon magic her ancestors have engaged in. I think that the Song of Ice and Fire will actually have the Starks do that as well. They may have whitewashed them a little bit for the show because they wanted some clear good guys in the end, but it would feel very George R. R. Martin if we had the Starks having to grapple with the consequences of the Weirwood magic and the actions of someone like Bran the Builder, and they may have to do this face to face down in the crypts. At least potentially, it feels like it would be really cool, and it feels like it's decently well set up. When it was revealed in the television show that the Night King was still alive and he was going to be the leader of the others, George was asked if the Night King from his books was still alive, and he said, well, in the books he was a different character, he lived thousands and thousands of years ago, he's no more likely to be alive today than someone like Bran the Builder or Lan the Clever. As I've laid out, given that we know that Bran the Builder was connected to the Children of the Forest and the Weirwood magic, and given how we've seen that working ever since Bran has gotten to Bloodraven's cave, it's actually not that unlikely to suspect that Bran the Builder would still be alive today. And in the show, we were shown the Night King was still alive today. And yes, I do know that he was a different Night King, but they still called him the Night King. And most importantly, for what we're talking about here, I really do think that the book Night King, whatever he was doing at the Night Fort, was likely to involve Weirwood magic. So Lan the Clever's basically the only one that I can't pin to being strapped up to a Weirwood and therefore likely still alive today. It is also possible that what George is doing is getting a little cute, and he has all three of those figures sort of reincarnated into the modern day, right? Tyrion's the modern day version of Lan the Clever, Bran would be the modern day version of Bran the Builder, and I think that would leave Jon Snow as the modern day version of the Night King. That's another thing that's going to be coming in a future video soon. Without fully getting distracted by topics that are going to be their own entire video soon, I really do think there's something to be said for the idea that George does like his characters to mirror these characters from the Age of Heroes. Tyrion is obviously very much like Lan the Clever, and Bran, as we've talked about this entire video, is well set up to be a new Bran the Builder. It is possible that if he was hinting at anything deeper that's going on, he was just hinting at how these characters are seemingly represented again in the modern day in this way. Or he could just be saying straight up, no, the Night King in the books is dead, he lived thousands of years ago, and then just happened to list two other characters, and maybe I'm going completely insane by drawing this Weirwood connection. But there is another sign that perhaps George R. R. Martin's mind is in the place where Bran the Builder could still be alive. We've talked about this before on the channel, but when I learned this, this is the thing that made me go from like 30-40% chance that I felt like Bran the Builder could still be alive, sustained by the Weirwood roots, up to like 60-65, maybe even 70% chance. This really shifted the likelihood to the point where I take the idea very seriously now. That thing that I learned about comes from the game Elden Ring, which George is responsible for all of the ancient lore for. And if you are still out there at this point wanting to play the game spoiler free, definitely spoilers coming for Elden Ring from here on out. In Elden Ring, there's a character who is such a one-to-one knockout comparison to Bran the Builder that it's almost crazy. The magic in Elden Ring is definitely turned up a level from where it is in A Song of Ice and Fire, so basically this is a slightly more magical version of Bran the Builder, but realistically their place in society is pretty much the same. The character in question is called Marika the Eternal, and she's essentially like the god of this age in Elden Ring. What she did a long time ago is basically tied herself up to the giant magical world tree that is a vessel for the Golden Order, that is basically sending the magic into the world and running society. It's basically the Weirwood system being the source of the Old Ways magic. The Golden Order flows through the Erd tree in a similar way to the Old Ways flowing through the Weirwoods. So, in the ancient past, America, along with the help of this giant magical tree, went around and subjugated everybody else. Sounds a little bit like the Starks now, doesn't it? Then you fast forward to the modern day, and America the Eternal is missing, no one knows where she is, but to this day, her descendants are the most magically powerful beings out there in the world, and they still basically run the show. So, in the ancient past of each of these stories, you have this incredibly important ancient founding figure, who was tied in with the magic of this giant powerful system of world trees, who is now in the modern times missing or gone or disappeared, and whose descendants are out there basically running the world. In case the comparison wasn't hitting home hard enough, America the Eternal's descendants also have these half-wolf shadows that are out there helping them out and making sure that the will of this great magical tree is being done. So the Starks warg into wolves to make sure that the old ways are followed and that the Weirwood's will is followed, and the Empyreans are out there with their half-wolf shadows, making sure that the will of the Erd tree is followed. It's all the same system, just one of them is much more magical than the other. In one case, these are literal gods and demigods, and in the other case, they're just as George said, Westerosi cavemen and normal humans. But again, as I mentioned, normal humans in a fantasy world who are still capable of some decently powerful magic. So if both of these systems match up so well, then when we find America the Eternal, where is she? Well, she is strapped into the central magical world tree of this entire system, and her body's basically in this decaying state where it seems like she might even want to die. In the game, one of the main things that you're doing is teaming up with someone who's capable of magically becoming the replacement for America the Eternal. And then you can shift the world forward into a new age and America is killed. The state that Marika's in at the end of the game when you find her is really reminiscent of the state that Bran sees those greenseer bodies in when he's looking in Bloodraven's cave. They are decaying and sitting there basically just waiting for whatever happens. I've talked in the past about these bodies as well as the shadows in the House of the Undying, and I'll be talking about them again in more detail in that video that's coming soon, but I really do think there's a good reading of the text that says, yeah, these shadows wanted death, and these bodies down in the roots, if they could talk, that one that tries to open its mouth to speak, if they could talk, well, then they might ask for death. At some point, you would think you might get tired of this immortality that these greenseers seem to have. Just staring at the side of a cave wall forever, or potentially, if you're powerful enough, still warging out into ravens and observing things. At some point, you would think that would get old after many thousands and thousands of years. Bran thinks about it when he says how he doesn't want to go on long after his friends are gone. At some point, it would get pretty sad. When you see the House of the Undying, it's a hall awash in gloom, and when Daenerys starts burning those undying shadows, they start to dance as they burn, almost like they're happy about what's going on. As I said, I've talked about that in full detail other places. I won't get into the weeds about why I think that's the most likely reading of the House of the Undying, but I do think that is what's the most likely. So when you have these immortal greenseer bodies who are seemingly just husks who may want that immortality ended, and you have these immortal shadows who are in a hall awash in gloom who seemingly are dancing as their immortality is ended, well then it sorta seems to make sense that maybe Bran the Builder would be in a similar position. That's why I found it so interesting that one of the leading theories that I've seen in the Elden Ring community around Marika the Eternal is that she was orchestrating her own death as well. When you replace her at the end of the game, it seems pretty crazy because you're ending an age that's lasted for thousands and thousands of years, and was backed by someone who was magically powerful enough to keep herself in control and immortal forever, and you're killing her and taking control. Keep in mind as I break all this down, I'm definitely not an Elden Ring expert, so if people have corrections down in the comments, they may be right. But when you fight the actual final battle, you're fighting against this giant beast that is a personification of the Golden Order, the thing that Marika tied herself to. But it would seem to make sense that Marika was actually in conflict with the Golden Order at the end. She was actually out there using her power to orchestrate her own death and betray the Golden Order and end the Age of the Erd Tree, even though that would mean the end of her life, or perhaps because that would mean the end of her life. When you see the suffering, decaying state of her body, it can't be a pleasant existence. So, without going into full detail, I really do think that, yeah, Marika the Eternal in the end of Elden Ring was orchestrating her own death. And I think that if Bran the Builder is still out there alive, there's a decent chance that he has been also orchestrating his own death and the end of the old ways, and Bran being ready as his replacement, so that the world won't be completely destroyed as this entire system comes crashing down. What exactly the crashing down of that system will look like and how exactly it could be solved is something that I look forward to getting into very soon, but not in this video. That's where I'm going to have to end things for today. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts on anything down there in the comments. Make sure to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Check out the Patreon if you are so inclined, and I'll be back with something else very soon.